Welcome to 7-Minute Torah, an exploration of the weekly Torah portion with me, Rabbi Micah Streifer. If you enjoy this podcast, please feel free to subscribe or comment or share it with a friend. The parsha this week is called Achrei Mot-Kedoshim, and among other things, it contains what's called the Holiness Code, the set of chapters in the middle of Leviticus that teach about how to live a holy life. So you have a mix here of ritual laws like Shabbat, worship, different laws of sacrifice, and also ethical laws, giving tzedakah or charity to the poor, or paying a fair wage to a worker. And at the heart of this parsha, at the heart of the Holiness Code, and maybe even at the heart of the Torah, is Leviticus 19:18, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. All right, we are live here with Rabbi Evon Yakar. Evan, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Micah. Rabbi Streifer.
Rabbi Yakar. We've been friends for a long time, and you are the rabbi today, the rabbi of Temple Bat Yam in South Lake Tahoe and North Tahoe Hebrew congregation. So you're the rabbi of all of Paradise, North and South Paradise, right?
I have not heard that yet, but I like the sound of that. It rings well, yes.
So for our listeners, after our Parsha discussion, we're going to have some Q&A with Rabbi Yakar, get to know him a little better, how he thinks about Judaism and about life, just the minor questions. But first, so let's talk about this week's Parsha. You told me this is your bar mitzvah portion.
My bar mitzvah portion, it's my wife's bar mitzvah portion.
And coincidentally, it's also my bar mitzvah portion. So that's a lot of Kedoshim. Right. Was that 1992? Was that the year of your bar mitzvah also?
92 for me.
I had no idea. You and I, May 9th, 1992, we were reading the same portion at the same time. Who could have thought?
Amazing.
All right, so what's special about Kedoshim? Other than being personally meaningful, what made you want to talk about this parsha?
Gosh, I think the pause that it represents to me in Leviticus, a different flavor, right? That it's not as black and white as the sacrificial rite, has a little more human feel. Maybe it resonates more because it's something a little more applicable. I think that is what jumps at me. I look forward to it each year when we get to the book of Leviticus.
Much of the rest of Leviticus is very priestly, right? It's sacrifices, it's skin diseases, but you have this sort of island of ethical material in the middle of Leviticus. And actually, some people say this is literally the middle of the Torah, right? The middle chapter of the middle book of the Torah. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think it's coincidence, or do you think that this was purposefully placed at the middle of our holy book?
That's a great loaded question. I think the idea of these ethical principles being the fulcrum, kind of that leveraging point between perhaps ritual and ethical, as taught through narrative and our people's experience and memory and law. Is there something to that literally? No, in my opinion. But is there something to hold and explore and understand that more deeply as that fulcrum point? Absolutely. I think that there's a lot in that, whether it's the, love your fellow as yourself, or whether it's, not putting a stumbling block before the blind, or those pieces, those things being what our behaviors center on in the Jewish realm and in the human realm, I think can give us a lot of help in that moral compass and that guidance.
Yeah, and there's that very famous story of Rabbi Hillel, who's supposed to teach all the Torah while standing on one foot, right? And this is what he says: what is hateful to you, do not do to anyone else. That's the whole Torah, and all the rest is commentary. So there's some kind of sense of where the Torah grows out of the central verse of this parsha, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And so I guess I like that language of it as a fulcrum, that all of Judaism kind of revolves around how you as human beings treat each other.
And not a fulcrum like the teeter-totter on the playground. For me, it's like a 360, right? It's the point on which, the compass arrow kind of balances all the way around. And I think that can be a real guiding light, a guiding set of principles. And here's where I think I've developed a little bit anyway, since I was 13, that it was a guiding set of principles Jewishly, but I think the universality of this part of Torah is really powerful. Not only can it reach everyone and be a good framework for most, if not all, human beings to operate with, or at least study and explore and pull off the layers. And I think that to me is the perhaps more powerful piece now as a approaching middle-aged rabbi than a bar mitzvah boy.
You're far from middle age, Evan.
I'm not that far behind you, so.
That's true. So do you think that's where the ritual stuff comes in? I mean, this portion, as you say, it's so universal. Love your neighbor, love each other. It's almost so importantly ethical that it's almost not Jewish, right? It simply is, that's what it is to be a human being. But this portion's also teaching us about worship and dietary laws. And the whole picture here is what we call the holiness code, this idea of how you live a holy life. So that ritual stuff, is that the Jewish part of it? Is that the Judaization? Or would you say, is there something Jewish about all of it, including the universal ethical pieces of this portion?
When I work with bar mitzvah students, we talk about the ritual versus ethical mitzvah, the things that make us uniquely Jewish, the ritual, and the things that really are good for everyone to do. And we talk about Shabbat as a ritual. They experiment with creative ways to make Shabbat meaningful, like having ice cream for breakfast, for example, on Shabbat morning. And the ethical, that's what I call their Tikkun Olam project, their opportunity to bring the shattered parts of God and bring some more light into the world, and their mitzvah project, as it were. And we talk about that balance. So I think the ethical might be that stretch beyond Judaism. But what I heard in your question is it something uniquely Jewish, even at its core, at its seed? And I'm not sure. I would like to believe in my perhaps more universal moments and less particular moments, right? That this is something that grew out of the culture, the context historically, that our people began writing this stuff and began evaluating it and layering on it. And so they borrowed and gave to other cultures as well. And whereas the ritual piece, that is stuff, that unique, deep connection that we have with our understanding of the divine, beginning with the Abraham story as a Jew, as opposed to Adam, Eve, Adam and Chava and Noah. And was I hearing your question correctly?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about. I like the idea that the ethical mitzvot, and really this portion revolves around the verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, that I think it is deeply Jewish and uniquely Jewish without being only uniquely Jewish. That is to say, I don't think it's only ours, but I think it is also ours. I think that, we as a people have believed that this was core to who we are. And that may not be different from what Christians believe or what Muslims believe, but I think we view everything through kind of a lens of Judaism, which maybe is why love your neighbor as yourself is right next to the laws of how to worship, because maybe it's our way of loving your neighbor as yourself.
And the language itself is powerful. The language of love in there, and the language of reacha, right? Your neighbor, your fellow, this companion type relationship as opposed to other, right? It's not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. As important and beautiful as that is, the word itself has a sense of knowing that other person as opposed to other.
Yeah, I like that. What I think I'm hearing from you is actually that it's about relationships, that you love your neighbor as yourself because you're building relationships between human beings. And so ultimately, maybe the message is that when you look upon others as human beings, as part of this global family, then you see the importance of building relationships between us.
And all stemming from this idea of the B'Tselem Elohim, of being in divine image, and that this is our godliness coming out too.
I love that. So what I learned today was that I'm required to love my neighbor as myself, and that I can eat ice cream for breakfast on Shabbat.
Making Shabbat special. What better way?
Perfect. Thanks again to Rabbi Evon Yakar for being our guest and our teacher this week. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to do a little Q&A, a few bonus minutes with Rabbi Yakar. So if you're interested, please do stick around after the closing credits. And as this portion teaches, may it be a week to look around and see the goodness, the godliness, the holiness in everyone around us. And as always, thanks for listening, and have a great week. All right, so as I mentioned before, I want to do a couple bonus minutes with you now, just to ask you some questions not about the Torah portion, but about you as a Jewish thought leader and as a Jewish person, so our listeners can get a sense of you. So as I mentioned before, you are the rabbi of both Lake Tahoe congregations. So what's it like being the rabbi of two different congregations? And also, what is it like being the rabbi of Paradise? And I'll just mention for our listeners that you told me that you once skied to work.
I have cross-country skied to work. I've also downhilled from one of the resorts to one of the buildings, the one on the South Shore, from Heavenly Mountain Resort. And so yeah, that's a pretty cool perk of where I live, and being somebody who recreates in the way I do. I think there's a lot of opportunity in bridging cultural gaps and learning from two cultural environments, organizational cultures, as it were, at the same time, and a lot of challenges. Right, I have two boards, so I have two presidents, I have two treasurers. Right, that's a whole other thing to wrap your head around. And I'm not just talking about that means two board meetings a month. It means you have two distinct cultural ways of processing and arriving at decisions in terms of governance in nonprofit worlds. And that's been a lot of learning for me, and some plenty of struggle too.
Do your congregations do a lot of programming together? I know they're at opposite ends of the lake.
So it's fascinating. Both are in their late 30s in terms of organizational history and memory. And the only thing prior to my arrival on the North Shore, so I've been the rabbi at Bat Yam in South Lake for 10 years, and 4 years ago began also as the rabbi on the North Shore. And prior to me being the rabbi at both places, the only thing that was shared on a recurring every year basis was second day Rosh Hashanah at a state park that's about equidistant between them. So an outdoor second day Rosh Hashanah celebration. When COVID hit, I immediately called my dear friend, former mentor, now still a mentor, but we're much more colleagues and work as partners, who's in Sacramento. And we'd done some programming, retreat style stuff, camping retreats, an Israel trip together between the three congregations. I called them immediately, said, we're closing our doors. What are you doing? We're doing this together, not alone. We built this collaborative community between the three congregations, my two and his one. Our staffs working together, our boards working together, had a meeting between three boards. And so I believe the way that we've coalesced in collaborative spirit through the COVID moment will continue for the Tahoe congregations. Religious school became 1 day a week instead of two separate, and virtually allowed us to maximize the resource of teachers. And it gave opportunities for our Shabbat and other study moments to be simultaneous and collaborative. And I think some of that will continue for the Tahoe congregations.
Yeah, it's amazing what we've all learned over the last year about how to be Jewish and how to form communities. I know we'll all look forward to being together again in person, but I think we have learned a whole lot about being a community this past year.
Absolutely.
So, all right, a couple more questions here. Is there one Jewish ritual that you find particularly meaningful?
I find a lot of them. What's fascinating, I'm going to divulge, and I don't know if this makes the cut here, but I feel like you asked our dear friend Joel, Rabbi Joel Simon, similar question, and I was thinking to myself, gosh, for somebody who loves ritual, I don't ritualize them. I am not a regular ritual person. In other words, I'm the bus driver who doesn't ride the bus on Shabbat, right? On vacation, I don't go to synagogue, right? I light candles. I do Friday evening. But I think, I have a similar response as Rabbi Simon did. I think the ritual of putting my kids to bed, which I'm blessed in my environment to do almost 5 nights a week, if not more, which is awesome as a rabbi that I'm home and available at bedtime for young kids to do that. But I think the longest standing ritual that is related tangentially to Judaism is when we, Micah, and you and I and Joel were in Jerusalem. I started calling my nuclear family. My parents are not married, but I started calling my nuclear family, both my parents and my two siblings, every Friday to wish them Shabbat Shalom. And that has continued. And if I don't call, I get a call from one of them on Saturday morning, just making sure everything's all right. And that has become a really important signpost in my week.
It's beautiful. I love it. And of course, that's a Jewish ritual. It may not be in the Talmud, but that's because they didn't have telephones. Okay, what's your favorite holiday?
Sukkot.
How come?
Twofold, right? I'm an outdoor recreationalist. I spend time outdoors. I work with Adventure Rabbi. I get that whole spirit of synagogue without walls. It's very much where I do a lot of my work. And so the connection to the natural world, to the cycles of nature that is a little bit more expressed in Sukkot than I think any other holiday. right? We know that most of our holidays have an agricultural or folk connection, and Tu B'Shvat might be this birthday of the trees, but it was also based in this tax cycle too, right? Let's remember that. Sukkot is about understanding our food, our sustenance comes from the earth, that we have to connect to that, as well as the spiritual side. So there's two components of the spiritual that I love. One is this minhag type tradition, this customary tradition, and I've never found a source for it, about after you break fast on Yom Kippur is when you drive the first nail of your sukkah or whatever, the first attachment. And what I love about that is the moment we are done beating ourselves down internally and spiritually and the work of teshuvah, we start rebuilding something fragile. We start rebuilding with that impermanent structure of the sukkah. And the second piece is the ushpizin, these spiritual guests that we welcome. And the reason that became so connected to me, just to share an anecdote, was I brought that idea to an interfaith Thanksgiving service with my interfaith crew, my colleagues, my dear friends in the Carson Valley area that I work with. And we do an interfaith Thanksgiving service. And one year they asked me to come up with our theme or thing. And I talked about these spiritual guests, Thanksgiving, Sukkot, kind of tied. And as each of us was sharing our spiritual guest, the host, a clergy, Father Chuck Durante, formerly of St. Teresa's Catholic Church in Carson City, he had this idea on the spot. He went to the back and pulled out a folding chair, an empty folding chair, and he put it on their bima, as it were, in the church for each of our guests. And for me, that represented that ritual, that tradition so beautifully. And so those three pieces, the driving the nail, the spiritual guests that we welcome, and the connection to the natural world.
I love that. Yeah, I share the love for Sukkot. I've always said Sukkot's my favorite Jewish holiday because it's the one where you go outside and build stuff. You know, I think just the idea of being out in nature, and I so much find God in nature. And so I really relate to what you're saying.
I love one of my favorite activities. I do it every third year, or so, because I don't want it every year for religious school kids. They have to do a Tahoe lulav. So we learn all about the 4 species, right? The myrtle, the willow, and the palm, and the etrog, and then they have to go into the area around our synagogue buildings, and they have to find 4 things that represent 4 native Tahoe things, species, natural things, and create this lulav and etrog as if it were, that. And we get some great examples.
Well, maybe we'll bring you back for a Sukkot edition later next year. All right, one last question. What book do we all need to read?
Wow. I was prepared for what am I reading now? I'm gonna promote my friend and mentor, Rabbi Jamie Korngold, the Adventure Rabbi, and her second book, The God Upgrade. What she presents in The God Upgrade is this idea that something happened in the last century in which we stopped upgrading our theology, our ideas about the divine God, mystery of creation, whatever we believe, as we always did. We as a people have been thinkers. We've written, we've dived in, we've altered, we've evolved our connection with and understanding of this God concept and idea. And some reason it stopped. It dropped off. And so the God Upgrade is great for the Jew sitting in the pews who reads the words of Mi Chamocha in English and is like, wait a second, that's not my theology. Wait, what are we singing? And then starts to dive in. The God Upgrade gives you a framework for understanding how to deal with that and how to respond. And I think also for those who are deeply knowledgeable and have spent time studying this stuff, it's yet another contribution to the layering of our relationship with the divine.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of us are thinking about. How do you find yourself in a text or in a prayer book or in a series of texts that don't always speak to what I think about the world or what I think about God? So Rabbi Evon Yakar, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been nice catching up and really nice having you with us.
Honor and a treat, and yasher koach to you for doing this, and look forward to continuing to take my 7 minutes of Torah a little more regularly now.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to 7 Minute Torah. If you enjoyed this program, please leave a review or a comment, and please pass it on to a friend. You can also subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great week.